welcome. We're really glad to see you all, and we have a hopefully really interesting hour of conversation ahead of us to discuss something that is on a lot of people's minds, and I hope it's on everyone's mind at some level, because when we talk about misinformation in the world we live in, and then add the word health to that, we're in a situation where, some misinformation doesn't hurt you. It's just annoying and you'll just, embarrass yourself. But some misinformation, if it's related to health, can actually hurt you. And we have to talk about what we're going to do about it. My name is Dan Gillmor. I'm co-founder of the News Collab at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications. I need a breath after that. And I am really happy to be here with three other members of our ASU Disinformation Working Group. It's a cross-disciplinary, campus-wide effort to tackle some of these topics. I want to introduce, first of all, Christy Roschke, who is the director of our News Collab and who helped put this together. And thank you, Christy, for getting all that done. And Celeste Sepsi is also with us, waving, and she's our colleague at the News Collab, does all kinds of stuff and is here to help moderate this and get people in and out and put up URLs and stuff like that. Thank you, Celeste. Briefly, and I mean really briefly, I want to just say that the News Collab has focused on the misinformation world since it was founded. What is it now, Christy? 2017, 18? And we don't focus on it just as a kind of woe is us category. We work in the area of, if you think about media supply, information supply and demand, we work on the demand side. We all agree we have to have a better information, more reliable, more trustworthy, etc. But we're looking at it from the perspective that we can't just upgrade supply, we have to upgrade us, that we have to be better at this. Call it consumers. I don't like the word, but we're users of media in various ways. And we think we have to do this at scale. And we've been doing a number of different projects along the way. And I'm leading up to what I want to just mention here, which is right now, some of you are probably enrolled in it. We're offering a free live online course that is self-directed, but I'll be in and out of the discussion groups for the next 3 weeks for Media Literacy Week. Thanks, Celeste, for posting the URL in the chat. If you're not already signed up, we encourage you to do it. There's a lot of really terrific stuff that we're offering in that course. And that the course is modified from its original to focus on science and health. So please do take a look. And again, you can do as much or as little of it. It's about 6-7 hours over 3 weeks if you do it the way we think you ought to do it. But of course, you can do it any way you want to. So one of the things I'll just say, and then I want to jump straight to our guests, Anna and Jamie, is if we can work together across disciplines, across professions, across ages, across cultural groups, across all kinds of things, and collaborate with each other, we really have a chance of making a dent in this problem. It's sometimes hard to be optimistic, but to use the phrasing of a friend of mine, I'm kind of a pathological optimist about all this stuff, because the alternative is to really get depressed, and that isn't going to help. So with that, I'd like to go, our guest from the Disinformation Working Group, Jamie Winterton and Anna Muldoon. I won't spend time introducing them. I'd like each of them for a few minutes to tell us what they do, why they do it, and offer some perspective from their particular expertise. And then we'll get quickly to all of you, because we want this to be conversational. So I'll start with Jamie, who is one of the real great talents in our university, crosses all sorts of disciplines and areas. And she's really an expert on global security matters. And a former Secretary of State recently said that civics, which all of what we're talking about is related to, is that teaching it really is now a national security imperative. And that's a really interesting concept. And I'd like to ask Jamie to tell us then how you see this health misinformation and science misinformation from a global perspective. And Jamie, off to you.
Sounds great. Well, thanks for having us here, Dan and Christy. I really appreciate the invitation. I did one of these last year on cybersecurity, and it was just such a fun and engaged conversation. So I'm really looking forward to today. So my name is Jamie Winterton. I'm the Director of Strategy at ASU's Global Security Initiative. And we started this group about 6.5 years ago. And the reason to create something called the Global Security Initiative is to have a way to address what we call wicked problems in security. So there's a whole literature on wicked problems. I'm not going to go into all of that, but these are problems that are fundamentally interdisciplinary, that have extremely broad scales from the individual impacts all the way up to global security impacts. These are problems that don't necessarily have a single solution, that we're not going to say, hey, we've solved this, we're done. It's always some kind of optimization. And there are lots of different kinds of stakeholders involved. And I tell you this just because I think disinformation is the quintessential wicked problem. It's radically interdisciplinary. We're never going to come up with solutions that only come from, just computer science or just journalism or just social science. We need to bring all of those groups together in harmony to be able to come up with progress in this area. It's also not anything we're ever going to solve. We can work really hard, but there's never going to be a point where we'll sit down and say, gosh, I'm glad we fixed disinformation. Let's move on to the next one. These problems evolve and we have to evolve along with them. And that's part of why the interdisciplinary approach is required. There's also this diverse group of stakeholders. I think we've all been impacted by disinformation personally. We probably all know people that, that we care about deeply, that have come across disinformation and it's impacted some of our relationships with them, or we know folks that have. And then it's got this wide range of impacts as we've discussed. This is why our group kind of took on disinformation as one of the areas in which we wanted to build. So we started the Center for Narrative Disinformation and Strategic Influence. It's a new center, so I have to remind myself what the acronym stands for. And within that, the Disinformation Working Group. So we pulled folks together from all across the university and said, let's talk about how we can contribute to making things better, and how do we engage outside the university. We can't just keep it all inside. That's not going to have the kind of impact we're looking for. How do we work with government agencies? How do we work with companies? How do we work with nonprofits? And media literacy is a huge part of that. Being able to not only reach out and give some of these tools and these conversations, but pull back in, understand the landscape, and build those things back into the research projects that we're developing. So that's kind of a just brief perspective on my group and why we exist and why I'm here in this conversation today, which I'm greatly looking forward to.
Thank you, Jamie. And now introduce Anna Muldoon, who is focused in a larger degree on health issues, and in particularly has done some astounding research on the COVID questions. And Anna, over to you. Why don't you just say what you're doing, and then whatever, some brief perspective on what you're finding.
Hi everyone, I am Anna Muldoon. It's important for my side of research to know that I came to studying misinformation and conspiracy through public health, which I recently discovered I've been doing for 12 years, which is awesome and horrifying. So I came into misinformation because I was interested in how it was affecting infectious disease response and changing our ability to control and treat infectious diseases in particular, which has always been my focus of research. So when I started studying this, COVID had not yet happened. And I frequently say, you know, I liked my 19th century research. That proposal was not a request for a massive evolution of the misinformation and conspiracy environment. So we are all probably pretty familiar with COVID misinformation at this point, from, you know, debates about whether the virus exists at all to a intense misunderstanding of its severity and its rates of hospitalization through theories about its origins and treatments and government responses, right? We've all heard this, but I think it's important to keep in mind when talking about health misinformation that these are not new issues. Conspiracy misinformation have been around basically for as long as humans have been around in some form. We are really good at filling in the gaps in what we know with stories that make us feel better, or with facts that make us feel better, or that give us someone to blame, which is a way of making ourselves feel better, just not a very effective one. So if you have been alive long enough, you probably know that we've had a rather large expansion of anti-vaccine movements, which, while they have always been around since the advent of vaccines, were very small. Then Andrew Wakefield happened, and in the 90s and early 2000s, anti-vaccine misinformation, conspiracy have expanded to amazing proportions. After all of the work that we have done on them, as of this past September, 10% of the American population still believe that vaccines cause autism. So while some of the things we've done have worked, that is lower than it was about 5 years ago. Some things have worked, but clearly not as much as we need them to. So COVID has been a learning experience, and hopefully as we continue to expand the interdisciplinary circles that we work with through things like the Disinformation Working Group and collaborations across universities, we will get to a place where we can better respond to these things quickly and effectively.
Thank you, Anna. That's a great introduction. I'll mention a couple of things about the area that I'm most familiar with, which is media and journalism. And I'll preface that by saying what my first question to all of us is, yeah, we have a big problem, but what do we do about it? Because I know that's all your question too. So forgive me for asking what you were about to. And I'll tackle that, one piece of that, in the context of journalism, because I'm deeply worried about journalism's ability to deal with situations of this kind, or at least journalism's willingness to deal with these things. Because I think journalists individually and as organizations have the capacity to do a good job. But I'm afraid that we don't see enough of what need to do. And the word I used a minute ago is the one I think is important, and that's context. We in journalism don't do context very well. And it's not hard to provide it. It involves some research. It involves saying, here's this fact, here's this new information, but here it is in text of a wider world. So when we give numbers of one of the top media organizations in the country recently had a headline about California leading in COVID infections or something, deaths, without mentioning right there that California is by far the most populous US state. So yeah, that's not an illogical thing that California would have a lot more of something because it has a lot more people. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I would just sort of beg there are any on this call to relentlessly provide context for what we do. And it would help a lot, I think, for people to not be misled by clickbait, forgive the expression, kind of headlines that often are designed just to drive traffic as opposed to inform the public. So I'll say that's one thing we could do right now that would really help. And I have other ideas, but I don't want to spend the time that we can hear from Anna and Jamie. So Jamie, I'll go back to you. Pick one piece of this and tell us what we can do, starting right after this call.
So I have been thinking about this since we had our organizational call a couple of weeks ago, because that is always the first question. Everyone wonders, what can I do? And I thought of a couple of things over the past few weeks. I think any of us with a social media account have had experiences where we run into something and it makes us so mad. And I have, of course, had that feeling on Twitter. We run across something and it makes you so mad. And stopping to step back from the keyboard and think, why does this make me so mad? And who benefits from my anger in this case? And there are a lot of groups that do benefit from anger. It's very easy to monetize somebody being angry. There's a piece in the Washington Post today about the reactions feature in Facebook, and it's amping up the level of engagement in disinformation and other anger-inducing topics. But being able to step back and think, who wants me to be angry about this and what should I do in response is a very powerful way to kind of short circuit that within ourselves, so we don't continue the cycle of adversarial propaganda. A lot of these narratives and these stories are pushed out by adversaries into our media simply for divisive purposes, simply to make people angry and to have them, it's easier for an adversary to get us to attack one another than it is for them to attack us. That's simply human nature. So that's the first thing that I would recommend is pause and think about who wants me to be mad at this and what's the right kind of response. The second thing that I've thought of over the last few weeks, just in engagements with friends and family members, is remembering that this is a marathon and it's not a sprint. I have close family members that have fallen into some disinformation traps and developed some beliefs. And, me coming right at them and saying like, well, that's not true, you know, and here's a scientific article that proves it. And, you know, you're, again, being angry, that's the purpose of a lot of this disinformation. So, you know, coaching and talking through some of these things, and you don't have to accept anything that you find ethically vile, obviously. But I have noticed over several conversations over months with family members, they will say, I saw this thing on Facebook, and I'll kind of like grip the corners of my chair. And then they follow up with, so I looked it up. Fantastic. That's great. And that didn't happen in 1 or 2 or maybe even 5 conversations, but that kind of seeding and just discussion and keeping those lines of communication open, I think are also really important, because we can do a lot more through relationships. Is that kind of what you were thinking, Dan? For that answer?
I think that's great advice.
Okay.
And if people want to divide and conquer, don't help them. That's wonderful advice. If it makes you angry, there's a good chance it was designed for that purpose. Anna, what piece of this do you want to tackle and help us all start doing as soon as we're done with this call?
So I have a couple of things that actually kind of hook onto what Jamie said as well. I think one of the things that I've been seeing lately that is really frustrating and hooks to both of what you've said is headlines often these days have very little to do with what the story says. So learning to recognize language in headlines that is designed to get an emotional response and pull you in is important and sort of crucial before you share that article. But I'm guaranteeing that everyone has heard the read the article before you share it, because I saw at least 2 yesterday where the headline was in fact completely opposed to what the article actually said, which was sort of fascinating. Washington Post and New York Times, by the way. So these are not like fringe news outlets. So I think that keeping an eye on the language that people use to draw you in is a really important piece of that emotional pull, and something that, as I've been studying this, I have decided is more and more important. And then the second point is, although emotional control when dealing with family members or friends who have fallen into conspiracy holes is not always the easiest thing, I will tell you from experience, the patience to question rather than tell people what they should think is a crucial piece of undoing this. I would love to say that we have technical solutions to deal with a lot of this, and some of those may make some difference, but I have come to the basic conclusion that this is a social problem, and technical solutions cannot erase social problems. So we have to learn how to have conversations with each other that can pull people back.
That's terrific. Before we go to our attendees and their questions, I want to ask a follow-up to that, Anna. Are there any technical measures do you think can help, as opposed to, I don't think that we disagree that there's nothing, that it's not a social issue, but is there technology that could help us get better at this?
So, and I'm sure Jamie has opinions on this too, but I would say yes. I think that some of the work, say Twitter has done, because I spend an unreasonable amount of time on Twitter, to automate flagging things that are trending and adding information at the top of those threads. I think that that's very useful. And I've seen a couple of those that were very interesting in how they debunked things. They didn't just say, this is all silly. Some of them, in fact, said, this is where this comes from. Here's the history of this idea, and approach with caution, which I think is a much better method. So I do know, however, that Twitter fact-checking project is a collaboration with journalists. So it's not totally automated, right? They have to get a journalist to go out and call people like me and find out where those ideas came from and why they're trending at this moment. So I think that that makes a big difference. I think that some of the work to limit the impact of bots on social media is quite useful. I think that there is some potential in blocking divisive accounts. That one's a bit more controversial because it moves people into more private spaces. So that I think we need a lot more discussions about when and how blocking and removing accounts changes the conversation towards truth and when it simply amps up anger. That one's unsettled, I think.
Yeah.
So
we could have a whole separate conversation about the whether a small group of giant companies should become the arbiters of truth and speech in our online world. That's a separate issue. Let's go to folks. We maybe raise hands? Celeste, what's the best approach here? We don't have questions yet in the chat, so I'd like people to ask what they'd like to ask. If you can.
Yeah, I would say if people want to unmute themselves and ask questions, that would be great. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to drop them in the chat.
Yeah, good morning, folks.
Hello.
Yeah, hello. Mike Hancock. Let me turn off my other sound over here. So I'm a digital audiences major with the Cronkite School. Thanks for allowing us to be part of this important discussion this morning. Touching on what Jamie said, how we engage media users from outside the university circle to become concerned about this huge issue of misinformation. A very important question in my mind to begin with is how do we get people to care about the issue? Touching on what Anna said, how do we draw people in? The general public, the media users, we are all the media in these times. Do we need to make the topic fun and sexy in some way? Or would that be lowering our standards to get people interested?
I'll start. I don't think it's ever wrong to tell a good story that is accurate in context and helps people understand things at a gut level. It's pretty clear, and Anna would probably confirm, and Jamie, that the people who are spreading misinformation, sadly, are better at telling stories than a lot of the people who are involved in actual public health. If we're working on health information here, the CDC, God bless them, don't tell stories very well. They put out data and sometimes they get it wrong, and but they're doing it in good faith. But people who twist things turn out to be quite brilliant storytellers for malign purposes. Anna, what do you think?
So apologies if you can hear the leaf blower that just showed up outside my back wall. So I think that the storytelling aspect is a big piece of it, that a lot of the time, because science and public health are particularly concerned with fact, we are not always as good at telling stories, right? But I think that there is also a problem of attempting to explain uncertainty in rapidly evolving situations that there isn't a great answer to. No one particularly wants the experts to say, we don't know. We will, but we don't know yet, because that is not terribly reassuring. Unfortunately, particularly in rapidly evolving situations, that's often true in every field. And so I think one of the biggest things we need to do is learn how to tell stories about uncertainty and why you don't want people to give you a partial answer. that's not going to be that easy to get people to like, I think.
Yeah, the role of uncertainty in science is huge. And the fact that sometimes science will lead you down one path and then you find out that that's the wrong path and it leads you back over here. And understanding that that's the way that science happens. It's not because scientists are disingenuous or because they're lying or something's been uncovered, but there's such an intolerance for uncertainty. And I understand that particularly around public health. You want to know how to protect yourself and how to protect your family. And if you find a place that has answers and a place that says, I don't know. But I think being able to frame the importance of I don't know as really, I don't know yet. But when we do know, it will be well substantiated and we can build trust in that.
Well, that feels like such a key point. And anyone with a family knows that life is endlessly nuanced, yet somehow we expect binary answers, yes or no, in the public health and things that are at least as complex and nuanced. Christy, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I see that there's a question in the chat from Meredith that I'll go ahead and read for you all. It says, what can be done to instill trust in news media and fact-based sources again? People feel adrift and like they have no place to find the truth anymore. So I will turn it to, who wants to start with that one?
Oh man, there's two loaded words in there, trust and truth. And oh, you put those together.
I know, I was
we're
waiting for
standing on
someone.
the edge of a cliff. No, it's a great question. And it's a fundamental question. I think that's why it's terrifying, because it is really like the crux of it, right? How do we develop trust and then establish some kind of measure of veracity that people want to engage with? I think one really telling moment was a couple of years ago. And I remember this, I was standing in the lobby of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And it was right after the Nancy Pelosi video came out. Do you remember that? It was where they had like slowed it down and made her seem drunk. And I was there to talk to one of our program managers who was running a large program on media forensics. And we had focused a lot on detection of deep fakes, really niche computer science methods to determine the lighting and angles, and if something had been added to a photo, and then here comes this video, which was kind of crap, a really obvious fake, but people wanted to believe it. And that division between deep fakes and cheap fakes, and the fact that something that was technically so poorly done could capture the belief of so many people, I think was a real light bulb moment for a lot of folks. That it's not about the whether or not something looks true, it's whether or not somebody wants to believe in it. And so figuring out how to incentivize facts and incentivize science-based evidence, I think we would have to do first. I've just added a question to your question effectively, but that's, I think, what's underneath it.
Anna, do you want to add another question?
Probably, yeah. So I'm with Jamie. I think we all just like froze for a second in that's a deep question. I think the issue of trust in particular is one that has been expanding for quite some time. And many of the ways that we've tried to address it have failed us and in some ways made things worse, right? Arguing for balanced, which really needs air quotes, reporting when 98% of scientists believe one thing and 2% believe something else, and showing both views is a problem and part of what has undermined trust, right? So I think that as we move forward, we have to be really careful to look at the ways that we have tried to improve trust in the past and how they have failed us or increased the problem. again, I'm the terrible person that's going to keep telling you, I think it's a social problem. We need to figure out how to have better conversations with each other. I miss the debate sections that were in the newspaper when I was a kid, where you had experts talking to each other, because it let you actually see where they disagreed and why, rather than trying to create an idea that like experts say this. Because I promise you, on most topics, if you put multiple experts in a room, there's going to be some variation or a disagreement on minor points, but not major points. So I think things like that may be useful, or at least help people see that a general consensus is often more nuanced underneath, and that those disagreements don't mean people aren't trustable. It just means that human beings are human, including experts.
So Tamar had said she has a question building off of Meredith's, and Tamar's done a fair bit of research in these areas in her own. So not sure if she wants to share with me any of that trust insights or anything, not to put you on the spot, Tamar, but we want to go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think Anna's response actually really leads nicely into this. Just building on the idea of trust. I wonder what the panelists think about how we should be in media literacy, in news literacy, how we should be talking about or trying to distinguish between news outlets that are largely reliable, get things right most of the time, but make their mistakes, because they do, and how we should be seeking to contrast that or not with outlets that are really just manufacturing the news, that are seeking to spread lies and propaganda. Because I think that, like, just a few things that people have mentioned that were critical of the mainstream media just in this panel were, entirely true and valid. But I wonder if we're seeing people not making those fine distinctions between, okay, this is, a mistake, but I can trust this outlet overall. I think, like, what I've seen in my research is people really beginning to extrapolate from a few mistakes, from lesser mistakes, and saying I can't trust anything. So do we try and draw some kind of division? How do we draw people into different ways of thinking about different media outlets?
Let me try and tackle that one a little bit. I have in my back of my mind, I have a scale that I call my credibility scale, that I frame media reporting in, and it sort of starts at a arbitrary number, -30 over here, and it goes to +30 over here. And as an example, the BBC, the best English language news reporting probably in the world, broadcast, is mostly over in the positive area. There, it'll be, ranging from 30 down. So, once in a while, you point an arrow into the negative category. Whereas a anonymous commenter on a random social media account would start off at the near -30 and might occasionally poke into the positive category. And the point I think about that's important here is that some things start out with negative credibility. They would have to work really hard just to have no credibility at all. It's not at 0 and a positive. It's minus to plus. And I frame my media in my context is, do I trust them more than not? And do I have good reason? And I trust a few things a lot more than not, even though they screw up from time to time. Whereas some things that are relentlessly deceitful, may occasionally tell the truth. But I know how to, I have it in my mind what the difference is. I don't trust anything absolutely, because I think it's important that my context is, do I trust it a lot more than I don't, or something else? So I hope that is a framing that would help people, so that even though I'm fiercely unhappy with things that the New York Times does at times, I trust them a lot more than not, at the very least, to have a process in place to correct the mistakes, and to basically be relying on them for a lot of valuable information. I'll stop there. Anna or Jamie?
I think that process that you mentioned is probably an important piece, and maybe that's something to highlight more. Does a media outlet have a way to correct mistakes? How do they do their fact checking? How do they, if an outlet doesn't have any of these processes and says, well, we just report the truth. Oh, that's, I think even somebody who agrees with them would maybe find that a little bit flimsy, or at least I would hope so. So pointing at what are those underlying processes that a group has, I think another thing that is powerful is framing disinformation as an adversarial threat, as something that is often seeded and then perpetuated from a foreign adversary. I remember talking to a relative that said, well, what is disinformation? If I say something that they don't like, I'm not sure who they were in this case. If I say something they don't like, am I going to get banned for disinformation? I said, well, disinformation is a much bigger problem than you misunderstanding something or saying something somebody doesn't like. I mean, there's protections for both of those things, but like this, it really is coming from outside the country to whittle away at the fundamentals of democracy. And that was a paradigm shift for her.
So Vincent in the chat actually just asked a question that fits right here. So I think it's worth noting that Jamie has been focused primarily on disinformation, which she just defined. I focus mostly on misinformation, which, yes, is not done with the intent to deceive. Often deceptive, but not with the same kind of intent to sow political discord and strife. Since that seemed like it was coming up.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we have been kind of using these two terms without it. And they do have some intersection points.
Oh yeah.
Like foreign adversaries don't throw stuff into the media just to see what sticks. Like they know what our national social vulnerabilities are, and they know what our hot buttons are and what to push. So, Anna started by talking about vaccine distrust, knowing that is a conflict topic in the United States means that a foreign adversary can poke at that and try to push their intents through that channel.
Let me just interject that the definitions of these words are not agreed on by everyone in the field. I personally put misinformation as an umbrella term under which disinformation, mistakes, other things would go. But certainly not everyone agrees with my framing. There is no universal agreement on what these words mean.
This is one where
just to make it more confusing. Sorry.
We could do an entire debate on the definitions if you guys want to help me with an article I'm writing.
So we have. Oh, sorry. Yeah, were you going to respond to Tamara's question?
Yeah, I think we talk a lot about trusting outlets, right? And I think actually it might be that we also need to do media literacy education on the language in the articles themselves, because outlets get purchased and that can shift their trustability on some topics. And I think that you can see differences in the style and how people are presenting you facts in articles that have more basis in reality, let's go with that, than others. And so I think that while we need to talk about trust in outlets, it's also important to help people understand how to evaluate the article itself, because a good outlet can have a bad article.
I want to just add here that outlets is a limited framing. I trust some individuals far more than I trust even the best journalism organizations on the things that these people know really well,
right,
and where they follow it closely or typically are involved in the field. And in a world where anyone is a media creator, and we all are, it makes it much more complex and difficult to sort it out. But the value we can derive from that ability to find people who really know what they're doing is a great benefit, I think, even though it has led to a number of problems. And I see a question about algorithms, which, wow.
We have
go
quite
for
a
a
few
while on that one.
questions, and Ron actually came on and raised his hand a minute ago, and I want to make
Oh,
sure
okay.
he gets a chance to ask his question.
Great.
I want to make one quick observation / question around Tamar's question and your answers. All of this distinguishing between outlets is fabulous, but presumes that people have the wherewithal to know about all of the different things that happen in the media landscape, and B, have the time and the desire to learn about those things, as opposed to just picking and choosing, which is more accurate to how people get information. So I'd be curious at some point, perhaps this conversation or in another conversation, to figure out how you've overcome that battle. Because if you're not going to put in the time to establish your own credibility scale, maybe because you just don't even know what would go on that scale, like how do we solve these problems? Because I think more people are in that category maybe than in our category of like super media users. So it's a challenge for sure. But Ron, you're up.
Well, you kind of led into it, Christy, so thank you. But really what I wanted to touch on again is trust. So we talk about trust in the media and factual reporting, but I can tell you from experience with some of my family members, they trust the misinformation. They are in a feed loop of misinformation. And we had a couple of family members that were actually going to get the vaccine. And then they received a YouTube video and they changed their mind. And my daughter sent me the video, and it was so, well, to me, ridiculous. I mean, this lady doctor put a drop of Moderna vaccine on a slide, and then after 2 hours it changed colors and irradiated and colors she had never seen before, and then some creature rose up out of the slide. I mean, I quit watching it then because it was so ridiculous. And in researching her, it became very apparent that she was a long-standing member of this whole group and had spoke at different rallies. They are locked into this. These people are seeing the same thing on multiple sites, and these are maybe typically far right, but they trust that. They are not going to go to AP and look for information or disinformation. Those people, it is very difficult to have that discussion. You can't tell them to go and find it. They just aren't going to do it. So that's kind of the answer I'm looking for.
I feel like we should start with Anna on that one.
I know exactly what video you're talking about. Just slightly terrifying. So I think that one of the things that we often skip in these conversations, and I think we skip it because it's very hard to address, is that misinformation in particular is a social network problem. And I do not mean an online one. I mean, my uncle sending me a video or a friend sending me a video and me watching it and believing it, right? And I think that it is unbelievably hard to track those outside of small social interactions. And so we often don't talk about them. But this is where I have an entire spiel about how to talk to friends and family about conspiracy in particular, but also misinformation, because I honestly believe that the only way to address that is all of us as individuals asking questions of those people, because you're not going to convince them by saying you're wrong, right? When someone walks up to you and says everything you believe is wrong, you go, all right, fine, I'm not talking to you, and walk away. So it requires of us as the individuals who would like to convince a lot of self-restraint and a lot of patience and a lot of questioning about what in that information appeals to you and why do you believe it? Because sometimes people believe it because of just who texted it to them, right? If I get something from someone I trust and believe, I'm much more likely to believe it. We've shown that with research over and over. And if someone I trust and believe in asks me why I think something, I'm much more likely to question it. And so I think that we're going to need face-to-face in our physical human networks solutions to things like that, because online spaces don't replace the human, and they're not going to, no matter how much we love studying them because they're easy, or how much we think that they've replaced human contact.
We're going to deputize all of you to be part of this brigade of humans who help other people understand better why they think things and maybe make some progress. Anna's, if you have your things you want to point to on that, Anna, drop them in the chat. We can send them.
So Angelo, Dan was referring to the question about algorithms before. This is Angelo's question. He says, are we being sold to believe that AI and algorithms could find and filter out what humans cannot? Are we placing too much responsibility on artificial interventions? Jamie, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. And that's a good question. So AI can often find things that humans can't, just the different kinds of features that it's able to look for. And I think there is some promise in using AI to find the spread of disinformation. So where you see a very rapid increase in something trending, or you see there are some features in the way that things spread in social media that that could be picked up by algorithms. What I see happening, though, also is AI getting used as an excuse for the lack of attention that gets paid to content by humans. Companies will say, well, we're going to let AI handle it. They're good at that. And so we don't have to worry about it. No, we still have to worry about it. This is a partnership between people and machines to try to figure out, how do you identify those features? How do you train your machine learning algorithms what to look for, and then how do you adapt them? Because this is a game of leapfrog, right? When we figure out, hey, here are the features of these particular disinformation campaigns, and so we have come up with ways to dampen their spread or to mute some of them. They continue to evolve. So I think there is a lot of promise in using machine learning, but it's not the panacea that a lot of companies are saying that it is.
I do agree. The media, the machine learning, keep in mind that humans wrote the programming that creates the machine learning in the first place. And the opportunities to inject bias there are enormous, whether it's deliberate or inadvertent. And we really have to think about, I like the word of a partnership between humans and machines here, because I think that's the only conceivable way we're going to do it. And part of it is what Anna was advising, is that we have to go from the micro to the macro, and we have to use everything, not try to find the magic answer. There isn't.
I think
So- Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anna.
I think the only thing I have to add is that we do really like to believe that AI and algorithms will solve our problems, but so far it's much easier to detect disinformation than misinformation or myth. And it's much easier to detect when there are bots involved. Unfortunately, a lot of the misinformation and conspiracy theory that we have in the United States is absolutely homegrown. Like, we did this to ourselves. And so we can only do so much with automated means when it's only partially an external and automated problem. So yeah, human and AI partnership. That was a really good phrase, Jim.
So there's a question in the chat, and then I see that Vi has her hand up. So I think we have time to take both of those. And Angelo has a question if we have the time for the third before work, because we're quickly running out of time. This has gone so quickly. So Monica's question in the chat is interesting. She said, oh, is that someone related to you, Anna?
Yes.
I love it. I love it. So Monica's question is, I listened to an interview with Kara Swisher and Maria Ressa, and they both changed disinformation to propaganda now. What do you all think about that? So Dan, do you want to start that one?
Sure. And with the disclosure that I've known Kara for decades, and Maria is a dear friend, and I am so proud of her. I put propaganda, again, in my hierarchy of terminology. I put it under misinformation, one form of it, except that propaganda is not always wrong. Public health message to get your kids vaccinated is propaganda. That's good propaganda. And the connotation of bad with propaganda is something that came out of warfare and dictatorships and Nazis, etc. But sometimes propaganda is good. Let's keep that in mind. I think we can go down a not terribly productive path to try and spend too much time defining the terms, but to understand what is involved in these various things is worth doing. I think doing things about them is more productive than defining them at the moment.
Jamie?
It's interesting because, yeah, propaganda does have a certain connotation of negative, and, maybe being able to peel mis and disinformation apart linguistically is useful. I think I want someone to do a study on this. I think it's really interesting.
I think what we're learning is that we need an entire hour just to discuss definitions, because I suspect that we all disagree on where the edges of those definitions are.
I think that's probably true. So we are at time. If you have 30 more seconds so that Vi can ask her question, we can do that and then wrap it up.
Let's do it.
Vi's going to ask the question. I don't know if it'll get answered. It seems like in a lot of this misinformation, there's the storytelling marketing aspect that feeds into fear and emotion. And my question is how do you, what can you do to overcome the pushback when it comes to fear and emotion? Like I said, I don't know if that's a question that can be answered, but that's a big part of overcoming the untruthful information that's out there.
I think Anna is best equipped of our group to answer that question.
I think we need to tell better countering stories, first of all. But I think also that on social media, some of the flags that I see pop up that say things like, this is intentionally, emotionally, I don't remember what it says, like emotionally intense content or something like that, are useful, because they at least sort of twig your brain to be like, ooh, maybe I should pay more attention to like how I'm responding to this. but I think we need better stories against misinformation. I think that we have to get better at telling stories that help people understand what's happening and that help people see when they're being manipulated. And by telling stories, I don't mean fictional, right? It can be journalism, it can be talking about our science, it can be how we talk about misinformation to the public. But my line is always, we need better stories.
That's a
Thank
wonderful
you.
answer. And I want to commend that to our journalistic colleagues from the Cronkite School who are on this call. Think about stories that you can tell that will help in our constant dealing with problems in information world that we see. Are at time. I want to thank again Christy and Celeste for their work and helping make this thing happen, and especially to thank Anna Muldoon and Jamie Winterton for joining us. It's a joy to be colleagues of all of theirs and to learn so much from them all the time. And thank all of you for joining us. This has been really, and we could do many more like this. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you,
Thank
Christy.
you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.